Margaret sat quietly by the kitchen window, sipping her lukewarm tea. Outside, autumn leaves danced listlessly in the breeze, their faded gold and scarlet colors a muted reflection of her own life. It had been exactly 1 month since Richard left, and the silence in the house had grown deafening. Friends had long since stopped calling, no doubt influenced by Richard's calculated charm and carefully cultivated reputation. She glanced at her reflection in the glass, noticing the fine lines around her eyes, marks of laughter that had grown fewer over the years. Margaret remembered how Richard had mocked her aging, subtly, always cloaked in false kindness. "You were beautiful once," he would say with a soft smile, cruelly implying that her best days were long gone. Yet despite the pain, Margaret had always maintained a quiet strength, learned from her mother, who had taught her that dignity was something no one could ever take from her. When Richard walked out, smirking confidently with his new girlfriend, half his age and blind to his manipulations, Margaret felt relief mixed with grief. Relief because deep down she knew she deserved better. Grief because she'd spent 3 decades believing Richard's lies. As she stirred sugar into her tea, Margaret resolved that it was time to rebuild, to rediscover the woman she was before Richard chipped away at her confidence. She had dreams once: travel, gardening, painting, things she had put aside because they didn't fit Richard's image of the perfect wife. The sudden ring of the phone startled her, shattering the stillness. Margaret hesitated briefly before picking it up. A familiar voice greeted her softly, hesitant yet warm. "Maggie? It's Eleanor. It's been too long. How have you been?" Tears stung Margaret's eyes at the unexpected kindness. Eleanor had been her best friend once, pushed away slowly over the years by Richard's cunning influence. Taking a deep breath, Margaret steadied her voice. "Eleanor," she replied gently, "I think it's time we finally caught up." Margaret felt a stirring inside, a quiet flame of hope flickering to life. Maybe Richard was wrong. Maybe her best days weren't behind her after all. Eleanor invited Margaret for coffee at a quaint cafe, nestled in the heart of their old neighborhood, a place filled with memories from years gone by. Margaret hesitated momentarily at the entrance, overcome by the bittersweet nostalgia of simpler, happier times, before Richard's presence darkened her world. Inside, Eleanor was waiting patiently, her eyes warm and welcoming. The first few moments were awkward, filled with tentative smiles and brief silences. Gradually, conversation flowed, first cautiously, then freely, like water thawing after a harsh winter. They talked about mundane things, weather, gardening, books, but Margaret sensed Eleanor was gently steering the conversation toward deeper waters. "Margaret," Eleanor finally said, gently placing her hand on Margaret's trembling fingers. "I've always wondered why we drifted apart. I missed you terribly, but every time I reached out, Richard made it clear I wasn't welcome." Margaret sighed deeply, her throat tightening painfully. "Richard," she began softly, eyes cast downward, "was always good at making me question myself. He convinced me you'd grown tired of our friendship. He said you had moved on, that I was only holding you back. Eventually, I started believing him." Eleanor's eyes flashed with quiet anger, but her voice remained gentle, compassionate. "He was wrong, Maggie. Richard was a master manipulator. He isolated you so he could control you. It broke my heart to watch him chip away at your confidence. I felt helpless, unable to reach you." Margaret felt tears brimming, the weight of years lifting slightly. The validation, though painful, felt oddly freeing. She understood now that the isolation had been intentional, another tool Richard used to maintain his power over her. They talked for hours, unraveling painful truths and rekindling bonds that had never truly broken, merely strained. By the time they parted, Margaret felt lighter, the oppressive weight of loneliness easing off her shoulders. Promising to meet again soon, Eleanor hugged her warmly, whispering words Margaret had long forgotten to say to herself. "You deserve happiness, Maggie. Remember that." That night, alone in her house, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. A quiet determination. Opening a drawer she rarely visited, she found an old sketchbook, untouched since before Richard. Flipping through pages filled with half-finished sketches and dreams she had discarded, Margaret resolved to pick up where she had left off. She felt a flicker of excitement, the fragile beginning of rediscovering the woman she'd once been, and, perhaps, could become again. A few weeks after their heartfelt reunion, Eleanor invited Margaret to join a local painting class at the community center. Initially hesitant, Margaret was eventually persuaded by Eleanor's gentle insistence. The class met in a bright, sunlit room filled with the cheerful hum of conversation and the comforting smell of fresh paint. Nervous yet determined, Margaret chose a quiet corner near the back. The instructor, Clara, was a spirited woman in her mid-60s, whose laughter was infectious and whose gentle critiques encouraged rather than intimidated. Margaret soon found herself captivated, not only by Clara's enthusiasm, but by the simple joy of creating again. Each brushstroke seemed to lift a tiny piece of her lingering sadness, revealing parts of herself she had thought were forever lost. One afternoon, while absorbed in sketching, Margaret noticed a quiet man observing her work thoughtfully. Catching her glance, he smiled kindly, eyes warm and reassuring. "You have a gentle touch," he complimented softly, gesturing towards her canvas. Margaret felt warmth rise to her cheeks, unaccustomed to praise. The man introduced himself as Daniel, explaining he was a retired history professor who attended the classes as a way to keep himself creatively engaged. His gentle demeanor and easy conversation soon put Margaret at ease, and she found herself sharing small bits of her life, careful not to reveal too much. Over subsequent classes, Margaret and Daniel frequently found themselves gravitating toward each other, their conversations gradually becoming deeper and more meaningful. Margaret appreciated Daniel's patience and thoughtful nature. He listened attentively, never pressing her to reveal more than she felt comfortable with. One evening, after class, Daniel asked if Margaret would like to join him for coffee. A flutter of anxiety rose in her chest, but she surprised herself by accepting the invitation. Sitting in a cozy cafe, Margaret felt strangely calm. She found herself talking freely about her struggles, carefully omitting the more painful details. Daniel listened quietly, his gentle gaze comforting rather than intrusive. As the evening ended, Daniel smiled warmly, thanking her for trusting him. Margaret felt a quiet strength blossom within her, encouraged by the realization that someone genuinely saw her, not as Richard's discarded wife, but as a woman of worth and substance. For the first time in many years, Margaret felt truly seen and valued. Margaret looked forward to her art classes more with each passing week, not only for the solace she found in creativity, but increasingly for Daniel's calm presence. Their bond grew subtly through small gestures and quiet conversations. Margaret often found herself smiling spontaneously, a sensation that had become foreign over the years spent under Richard's critical gaze. One crisp afternoon, as they painted side by side, Daniel shared a story about his late wife, Grace. He spoke with tenderness and genuine respect, reminiscing about the happy years they had shared. Margaret listened attentively, moved by the depth of Daniel's emotion and sincerity. "It must have been hard to lose someone so dear," Margaret gently remarked. Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a quiet sadness, but also a serene acceptance. "It was," he admitted softly. "But I'm grateful for the time we had together." Grace taught me the beauty of truly seeing and respecting someone for who they are. I think that's rare. Margaret felt her heart swell with both warmth and a tinge of sorrow. Richard had never looked at her in that way, never truly valued her as Daniel had clearly valued Grace. His admiration always came with conditions, subtle demands she constantly struggled to fulfill. Now, beside Daniel, she realized the difference between manipulation and genuine care. After class, as they walked to their cars, Daniel hesitated slightly, clearing his throat nervously. Margaret, I've really enjoyed our conversations. Would you perhaps like to accompany me to the upcoming art exhibition downtown? Clara mentioned several local artists will be featured, and I thought you might enjoy it. Margaret felt her cheeks flush, heart fluttering in a way it hadn't for decades. For a brief moment, anxiety threatened to overwhelm her, echoes of Richard's dismissive laughter resurfacing. Yet, Daniel's hopeful expression quickly dissolved her fears. I'd love to, she answered softly, her voice steadier than she expected. Daniel's eyes lit up, his relief evident, and they parted with a gentle wave and shy smiles. Later that evening, Margaret shared the news with Eleanor, her excitement tempered by apprehension. Eleanor was overjoyed, reassuring her friend warmly. You deserve someone who truly appreciates you, Maggie. Daniel sees the real you. Just let yourself enjoy this. Margaret smiled, gratitude filling her heart. Still, a shadow lingered. Richard would eventually discover her newfound happiness, and she knew his ego wouldn't tolerate her moving on. She resolved to face whatever might come, determined to embrace this second chance at joy. The evening of the art exhibition arrived, and Margaret carefully chose a simple yet elegant dress, feeling a blend of excitement and nervousness. As she checked her reflection, she hardly recognized the smiling woman looking back at her, someone radiant, hopeful, and alive. Daniel picked Margaret up precisely on time, greeting her with genuine admiration. You look wonderful, Margaret, he said sincerely, his warmth washing away the remnants of her anxiety. At the exhibition, they strolled leisurely among the colorful canvases and sculptures, engaging in easy, heartfelt conversation about their favorite pieces. Daniel's gentle encouragement made Margaret feel seen and valued, unlike the critical assessments she had endured with Richard. Lost in conversation, they failed to notice the figure watching them intently from across the room. Richard, having arrived with his new younger companion, narrowed his eyes in surprise and irritation, clearly unsettled by Margaret's apparent happiness. Margaret's laughter drifted softly across the gallery, causing Richard to stiffen. Unable to resist, he approached, feigning pleasant surprise. Margaret, he drawled with forced cheerfulness, I didn't expect to see you here. You seem to be doing well. Who's your friend? Margaret's heart raced, but she steadied herself, meeting Richard's calculating gaze calmly. Richard, this is Daniel. Daniel, my ex-husband, Richard. Daniel greeted Richard politely, though Margaret could sense he perceived the tension immediately. Richard appraised Daniel critically, his forced smile barely concealing his displeasure. Well, Margaret, I'm glad to see you're managing on your own. Though, really, it seems quite soon to move on, doesn't it? Margaret felt the familiar sting of Richard's barbed comment, but Daniel's reassuring presence steadied her. She smiled gently, confidently. I suppose it's never too soon to rediscover happiness, Richard? Her composed response visibly shook him, diminishing his smug demeanor. Richard excused himself curtly, retreating to his new partner, whose confusion was evident. Margaret exhaled slowly, her courage bolstered by Daniel's silent support. The rest of the evening unfolded pleasantly, though a shadow of unease lingered beneath the surface. On the drive home, Daniel spoke gently, sensing Margaret's quiet tension. "He doesn't deserve your peace, Margaret. You've grown so much stronger than he realizes." Margaret felt a quiet pride swell within her, understanding that Daniel was right. Yet, as she arrived home, a subtle dread crept into her thoughts. Richard's ego had been bruised, and Margaret knew he wouldn't easily accept her happiness. She resolved firmly not to let fear control her newfound freedom, determined to embrace her journey wherever it led. Days after the art exhibition, Margaret felt a troubling unease growing within her. Richard had always reacted poorly when he felt slighted or threatened, and their encounter had undoubtedly bruised his pride. Eleanor sensed Margaret's anxiety and invited her over for tea, offering quiet reassurance and companionship. In Eleanor's cozy kitchen, Margaret shared her fears. "Richard seemed rattled," she admitted softly, wrapping her fingers around her mug. "I'm worried he might try to interfere, make things difficult again." Eleanor placed a comforting hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Richard thrives on control, Maggie. But you've grown stronger. You're not the same woman he left behind. And you have people who care deeply about you now." Margaret nodded, drawing strength from Eleanor's confidence. That evening, Margaret's fears materialized when she discovered an unsettling letter in her mailbox. It was Richard's familiar handwriting, sharp, precise, and devoid of warmth. With trembling hands, Margaret opened it, her heart racing. "Margaret, I thought you might be wise enough to avoid embarrassing yourself publicly. Our mutual acquaintances have been talking about your rather desperate display at the exhibition. You should reconsider the company you keep. Remember, appearances matter. Richard." Her initial shock quickly turned into anger, then determination. Margaret recognized the old manipulative tactics, shaming her into retreat, isolating her from others. But she was no longer willing to allow him such power. When Margaret showed Daniel the letter, his eyes filled with compassion and quiet indignation. "Margaret, Richard's words reflect only his insecurity and bitterness. Nothing about you," he reassured her firmly. "Your strength terrifies him." Encouraged by Daniel's unwavering support, Margaret decided not to reply, refusing to dignify Richard's manipulation with a response. Instead, she redoubled her efforts in the art class, pouring her emotions into vibrant canvases that Clara praised as deeply expressive. One afternoon, Daniel invited Margaret to a peaceful walk along the lakeside, sensing her lingering tension. Beneath the calming sway of willow trees and gentle lapping of water, Daniel took her hand softly. "Margaret," he began gently, "seeing your resilience in the face of everything inspires me. You deserve to know real happiness again, free from anyone else's shadow." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness, but gratitude. Daniel's words resonated deeply, strengthening her resolve. She realized she was not just surviving Richard's betrayal, she was thriving despite it. Still, Margaret knew Richard well enough to understand he wouldn't easily relinquish his grip. She braced herself for further challenges, determined to protect her newfound freedom and the precious relationships she'd forged. Richard's manipulations intensified over the following weeks, manifesting through subtle yet persistent intrusions into Margaret's daily life. Unwelcome calls from mutual acquaintances, clearly influenced by Richard's twisted narrative, became frequent. Each call carried veiled criticism about Margaret's supposed neglect of her responsibilities or inappropriate behaviors since their separation. Margaret felt the emotional toll, but found unexpected strength each time she confided in Daniel and Eleanor. Eleanor, familiar with Richard's manipulative tactics, provided unwavering reassurance, reminding Margaret of her strength and dignity. Meanwhile, Daniel became a steady anchor, his quiet presence and empathetic listening proving indispensable. One evening, Margaret was startled by an unexpected knock at her door. Opening it cautiously, she found Richard standing there, his expression deceptively calm, yet undeniably hostile. Her heart raced as she steeled herself for confrontation. "I think we should talk, Margaret," Richard said coldly, stepping forward slightly, forcing her to take a step back. Margaret raised her chin defiantly. "If you have something to say it here." Richard narrowed his eyes, voice dropping to a sinister whisper. "Do you really think someone like Daniel can replace what we had? Do you think he truly cares about you?" "You're fooling yourself. He's just pitying you, Margaret." The words were sharp, calculated to wound deeply, yet Margaret felt a new-found clarity rather than pain. She recognized the attempt to undermine her self-worth clearly now. "Your opinion no longer matters to me, Richard," she replied, her voice unwavering. "You've lost your power here." His expression flickered with surprise, quickly replaced by bitterness. "You'll regret this," Richard hissed, turning abruptly and striding away into the darkness. Later, recounting the incident to Daniel and Eleanor, Margaret felt a powerful mixture of relief and triumph. Daniel gently clasped her hand, his presence calming and supportive. "You handled it beautifully, Margaret. Your strength amazes me." Eleanor echoed Daniel's sentiments, adding warmly, "I'm proud of you, Maggie. You're finally free." Yet, despite her victory, Margaret couldn't shake a lingering sense of dread. She knew Richard wouldn't surrender his perceived control easily. Her courage had inflamed his resentment further, and she felt instinctively that their conflict was far from over. Determined not to let fear govern her, Margaret resolved to focus her energy on the life she was building, strengthened by Daniel's quiet, compassionate companionship and Eleanor's steadfast loyalty. Margaret's sense of peace after her latest encounter with Richard was short-lived. Soon after, Daniel began receiving anonymous letters filled with subtle threats and accusations. Initially dismissing them, Daniel eventually shared their existence with Margaret, concerned not for himself, but for the impact on her emotional well-being. The notes were carefully crafted to undermine Daniel's confidence and question his integrity, painting him as opportunistic and manipulative, a twisted reflection of Richard's own character. Margaret recognized Richard's familiar, calculated language and felt anger rise within her, mixed with anxiety. Seeing Margaret's distress, Eleanor immediately stepped forward, offering advice and emotional grounding. "Richard is desperate because he's losing control," she reassured firmly. "He wants you isolated, Maggie. That's how he regains his power. But you have Daniel, you have me, and most importantly, you have yourself." Strengthened by Eleanor's unwavering confidence, Margaret decided to confront Richard directly, determined to put an end to his destructive interference. With Daniel's quiet support beside her, she agreed to meet Richard in a neutral public place, hoping to minimize any potential harm. The cafe was bustling, providing a false sense of normalcy that contrasted starkly with Margaret's racing heart. Richard arrived promptly, exuding his usual composed superiority. "What's this about, Margaret?" he sneered slightly, eyes darting contemptuously to Daniel. "Do you really need him to speak for you?" Margaret raised her chin, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "I asked Daniel to be here because he respects and supports me." "Two things you never could, Richard. I know about the letters, the lies you're spreading. This stops now." Richard smirked coldly, clearly unfazed by her accusation. "If Daniel can't handle a little criticism, perhaps he's not as strong as you think. You're wasting your time with him, Margaret. We both know it." Daniel calmly interjected, his voice firm yet respectful. "Richard, Margaret sees you for exactly who you are. She doesn't need my protection. She invited me here as her partner. We're here together because she chose it. Your words have no power here." Richard's face darkened at Daniel's calm certainty, clearly rattled by their united front. For the first time, his composure faltered visibly, revealing a flicker of uncertainty beneath his carefully maintained mask. Margaret spoke firmly, her voice unwavering. You don't intimidate me anymore, Richard. You can't control me, or Daniel, or Eleanor. We're stronger than you think. Let this go, or you'll only continue to embarrass yourself. Richard rose abruptly, seething silently. You'll regret this, he muttered, storming away. Margaret exhaled deeply, relief flooding her. She squeezed Daniel's hand gratefully, recognizing she had faced down her fears, reaffirming the strength she had painstakingly built. Margaret found renewed joy and strength in her relationships with Daniel and Eleanor, slowly building a sense of safety and confidence she hadn't felt in decades. Yet, despite her brave exterior, an underlying unease lingered. She instinctively felt Richard wasn't finished. Her fears were confirmed one afternoon when she discovered a bouquet of roses left anonymously at her doorstep, accompanied by a brief, unsettling note. You'll always belong to me. Disturbed yet determined, Margaret showed Daniel the note. His calm demeanor cracked briefly, replaced by visible anger and concern. This isn't harmless anymore, Margaret. Richard's trying to intimidate you, and it needs to stop, he insisted firmly. Eleanor echoed Daniel's concerns, urging Margaret to consider taking action. Maybe it's time to involve the authorities. At least file a report, Maggie, Eleanor pleaded softly, visibly worried. After sleepless nights filled with internal struggle, Margaret finally agreed. Accompanied by Daniel and Eleanor, she reported Richard's escalating behavior to the police, her voice steady despite the tremors she felt within. The officer assured her they'd monitor the situation and advised her on precautionary measures. Weeks passed with unsettling quietness, and Margaret cautiously began to breathe easier. She immersed herself in her art, finding solace and confidence with each stroke of her brush. One day, Clara, her art instructor, enthusiastically proposed Margaret showcase a piece in the upcoming community art fair, a significant step for her burgeoning confidence. Margaret hesitated at first, but soon agreed, encouraged by Daniel's gentle excitement and Eleanor's proud encouragement. The preparations filled Margaret's days with purpose and anticipation. Yet, on the day before the fair, an unsettling message arrived on her phone, stark and chillingly brief. Are you really ready to embarrass yourself publicly, Margaret? Recognizing Richard's sinister style, Margaret's determination only hardened. Supported by Daniel's unwavering reassurance and Eleanor's fierce loyalty, Margaret chose not to respond. Instead, she poured her emotions into finalizing her painting, a vibrant, symbolic piece representing her journey toward freedom and self-respect. The morning of the exhibition dawned bright and clear, but Margaret's nerves were taut with apprehension. Daniel met her at the entrance, taking her hand gently. No matter what happens, Margaret, you've already won. Remember, Richard can't diminish what you've accomplished. Margaret entered the gallery proudly, her artwork prominently displayed, radiating the resilience she now embodied. As the visitors admired her work, she felt a deep, unshakable pride. Yet, in the corner of her eye, she spotted Richard, standing rigidly among the crowd, his expression unreadable, but undeniably hostile. Margaret steadied herself, resolved not to let his presence overshadow this moment of triumph. Tonight belonged to her, and Richard's intimidation no longer held any power. As the crowd mingled and admired her artwork, Margaret felt a sense of profound achievement, pride radiating from within her. Yet, Richard's lingering presence cast a subtle tension in the room. Determined not to let him diminish her triumph, Margaret approached him directly, her stance resolute. You came to see if you could shake me, Margaret began calmly, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. But look around, Richard. I'm thriving. You no longer have any power here. Richard's eyes narrowed, clearly taken aback by Margaret's confidence. You think this little show changes anything? You'll never truly escape me, Margaret. His voice dripped venom, his usual composure crumbling. Daniel stepped quietly to Margaret's side, his presence grounding her strength further. Richard, Margaret has already moved beyond your attempts to control her. Accept it. She's free from you. Eleanor joined them, her supportive presence completing Margaret's circle of strength. It's over, Richard. Maggie's happiness isn't yours to destroy anymore, she declared firmly. Richard, visibly shaken and humiliated, cast a final resentful glance at Margaret before turning and exiting abruptly. Margaret exhaled deeply, feeling the last remnants of fear and doubt slip away. Daniel gently took her hand, squeezing it softly. You were extraordinary, Margaret. You've reclaimed your life. Eleanor smiled warmly, echoing Daniel's sentiments, her eyes filled with pride and admiration. In the days that followed, Margaret embraced a newfound serenity. Richard's departure symbolized not only her victory over manipulation, but her complete emotional liberation. Supported and surrounded by genuine love, Margaret knew that her future was brighter and freer than she'd ever imagined possible.